Hello, lords and ladies. Today we're looking at World War I and how it was fought, which means we're talking about trench warfare and some of the technologies that come about in this war that are not exactly compatible with trench warfare. So, today's objectives. We're going to look at two in particular. We want to look at the role nationalism and imperialism play in the outbreak of World War I, which we do throughout this whole unit, and we want to discuss the role of technology in World War I and how it's going to change the way that this war is fought. So you might want to pause it if you need more time to write. Now, if you're a war person or you're interested in war, you probably already know quite a bit about how this war is fought. It's really a very old tactic that really resonates and starts in the ancient times and is used all the way up into this war. Now, what we're going to look at is World War I again. It's called the Great War. That's the nickname for it, and there's some reasons for that we'll look at in a second. But this war is, up until that point, the largest conflict that the world had ever seen. It involved all of these countries and millions upon millions of soldiers. So up until this point, the Great War, World War I, is the largest conflict the world has ever seen. Over 40 million soldiers are involved, just taking into account the British, French, German, and Russian troops. That's not taking into account any other countries involved in the war. Over 40 million just from those, which are the four main countries, but still, there are millions more soldiers on top of that. So the size of this war is really what's going to distinguish it, and the amount of countries involved and just how entangling those alliances were is really what's going to do it. Each of these countries, remember, nationalism plays a role here as well, that they are looking to make their country the greatest, the biggest, the baddest, the best, whatever you want to call it, but they are interested in doing that for their countries. And what we're going to see is that the Great War, due to this kind of desire and drive, is going to be pretty devastating. Now, again, World War I, the Great War, largest conflict in history up till that point. Sometimes in Russia they call it the Great Patriotic War. So there's a number of numbers given to this war. The Great War is the one we're going to look at. If you take a look, here's a photograph. This is a cover of a book that has been done on the Great War, right? And so you see the candle snuffer going over the candle and putting out civilization, okay? Alright, so how is this war fought? We know that it's through trench warfare primarily, and trench warfare is an ancient method of fighting, where you literally dig into the ground, and that is from where you fight. So the soldiers spend a lot of their time in the initial outbreak of this war actually digging. And what you're going to see is that trench warfare is pretty brutal. You dig these trenches all along, some of them going miles and miles and miles, and this is where you live. You eat, you sleep, you everything from this trench. So it's dirty, gross, not exactly the cleanest area. You got frog infestations. Now, between the two trench lines, when you went out of this trench and went to fight, it was called no man's land. That's the area between the two trenches, and your goal is to get an enemy trench and then to kind of, continue through their trench lines and gain as much territory as you can. Think about the conditions. The rain, the snow, whatever the weather is bringing is all coming into your trench. You've got bunkers dug in, and I'll show you some photographs of what these things could look like, because depending on which side you are on, they are going to be built a little bit differently. Where you are building them, it's all going to be a little bit different. So it's very difficult to live like this. You've got lice infestations, frogs, rats. They had these big brown rats that would come and eat, the eyeballs of the dead while they were sleeping, and while the other soldiers were sleeping not far away. I mean, there's all kinds of horrors that come out of these trenches. Trench fever, trench foot. We'll look at some of that soon. But what happens? So the Schlieffen plan, as I said to you guys in an earlier video, was the German tactic. What they figured was, we'll go into France, we'll bust it out quickly, and then we can concentrate everything that we have on Russia. So on the Western Front, now keep in mind, Germany is centrally located. So they're bordering both France and Russia. So on the Western Front, the area where fighting is occurring in France, you have the French teaming up with the British trying to stop the German advance. And what happens is, as these sides dig in, keep in mind they are having new technology, which again we'll talk about and you'll do another activity with shortly. But the trenches, when you're fighting now and shooting out into no man's land with machine guns, you're mowing down men at an alarming rate. And so what it really becomes is a stalemate, where neither side can really advance in any territory. Even if they take a trench, they don't hold it for long. They're usually overrun by the backup trench lines and kicked out and forced back across no man's land. So there is a deadlock on the Western Front for much of the 4 years. In contrast, this war, with wars all prior to and after it, is one of very, very little movement, because you cannot gain any territory through this style of warfare with the newer technologies that are emerging. So we're going to take a look at some pictures to try to show you guys exactly what we're dealing with when we're talking about trench warfare and what these guys were living in and working from. And this is a German trench. You can see that they've built up a fire step. They're really, really deep, the German trenches, but they're not super wide. So they step up onto the fire step and kind of position their machine guns either through those holes that they've dug in, which you can see the man is pushing his gun through. And then when they have to go over the top, they go over the top. This is a British line, and you're seeing that they've carved in some kind of small bunk areas where the men can kind of take naps when they're not on watch. So again, not exactly the most comfortable conditions, and this is what you're living, fighting, sleeping, everything from this whole time. This is a British trench, and these are the soldiers going over the top. You can see that there's artillery fire in the air, and that they are literally coming over the top of this trench and running out into no man's land at the urging of their commanding officer. This is no man's land, the view for the soldier primarily that you would see coming out, and this is after much fighting. This is after artillery rounds and craters are dug because of these bombs. You're going to see another shot of a different type of a battlefield, because that's relatively flat. This is no man's land in a hillier spot where you can see that there is some booby trapping and that craters have been left by the artillery shells coming in and exploding, and where the trenches are dug into hills. This is an active no man's land. This is where you can see them actually, and war photographers are numerous throughout this war trying to depict as much of this as they can, but you see that's an active no man's land. Here's another depiction where the soldiers are actually running through, trying to come back to their trench, and you can see that what they're running into is incredibly challenging and upsetting. Here we have another no man's land. This is where a man was recently hit. You can see that some of the soldiers are wearing gas masks because the gas attacks are starting and they know that they need to have these things on. If you're caught without one, this is a picture of trench foot. This is a soldier who has a pretty bad case of trench foot. This is something that the soldiers would be plagued by and threatened with throughout their tenure and whenever they were fighting. So sometimes it's not the actual machine guns taking you down, it's the conditions within the trenches themselves, because you cannot get that water out of there when it's raining. So in some of those pictures you saw some of these new technologies. You saw the gas masks and you saw the men wearing them through no man's land. Probably the most devastating weapon in terms of trench warfare certainly is the machine gun. When those men come out of those trenches, they are literally a moving target, and you are just being picked off with wild abandon. I mean, machine guns make the casualty rates go up tremendously. You can fire 400 to 600 bullets a minute with a machine gun in 1914, so it is catastrophic for these men. Tanks, we're going to take a look. I'll show you some German tanks and British tanks. American tanks look very much like the British tanks. And again, won't come in and be a factor until the very end of the war anyway for the United States. So the submarines, U-boats primarily, is what we're going to look at because those are the German subs, and those are the ones used with the most effectiveness in this war. Planes come in later in the war, but they have a devastating effect, as do the gas, but the gas is actually counteracted by the gas masks. So you have, a way for the men to avoid the kind of injury that they could have been susceptible to had they not had those gas masks. Hitler himself was actually in the hospital at the end of World War I, sorry. At the end of World War I, he had fought with the German military in World War I. He was a scout, fought very bravely, earned the Iron Cross. He was actually in a hospital recovering from a mustard gas attack when the armistice ending the war was signed. This is a German machine gun, and you can see the machine gun operator sitting there with it, but that's a German style. Here is the British style, and you see these guys wearing their gas masks as well. But this is a machine gun that we're going to see the British primarily using. I have another shot of a British machine gun. I didn't put it in here, though. And this is a German tank. So World War I tanks by the Germans were definitely primitive when you're thinking about what they had later on. This is a British tank, and this is more like what the United States tanks will look like. World War I tanks, again, very primitive compared to what we're going to see in World War II. Here's a German Unterseeboot. It's a U-97. This type of submarine is the type that you're going to see in unrestricted warfare. Here is a British bomber. Well, not really a bomber, a little bomber, dogfighter, that you're looking at in World War II, and here's a German plane from World War I. Sorry, they're both from World War I. I don't know why my brain's not working. But they're both from World War I, and you can see that they're biplanes. So again, the technology that we're going to see come into World War II is going to increase exponentially. However, these are the predecessors. These are the things, the baby steps that pave the way for those advances to come. So World War I, we're going to look a lot more at the technology in class with an activity, but what you should see is that this World War I style of warfare is going to impact into future wars because of the technology. Unfortunately, because they fought with trench warfare with these newer technologies, the amount of casualties is going to be dramatically increased. So that is a look into the warfare style and the technologies that occurred in this war, and I look forward to talking more with you about it in class. Have a good day.